All right, hey, we're just continuing basically along what we were just talking about. We're talking about Murphy and then making some quick connections with Rorty and Harding. What I want to do right now, just fairly quick, just a few slides just on some ideas pertaining to our contemporary situation here. So something that's been going on for a few years that I can only assume you're at least vaguely aware of, if not aware of in great detail. So I'm just going to refer to a couple of pieces. They're a few years old, but I think things are a little different when some of these tendencies or trends were a little bit newer. They just got a lot more attention, and to some extent we've gotten used to it a little bit. So in any event, I'm not putting any particular stock. I don't know anything about these particular authors. They're just people who seem to be expressing things which are fairly widely expressed, sometimes in different ways depending on how you're approaching them. But anyways, so the first is just this piece basically reporting on some survey data basically that seems to be supporting a view. Again, it's nothing surprising. It's fairly well known and it's much talked about, this sense of the country dividing into, well, at least two. All of this is put in terms of party lines, that is to say the lines of the two major political parties. There actually might be more potential, say, sides or perspectives, but in any case, more than one. There's a kind of unraveling here. He puts it this way, a kind of unraveling of a shared sense of national identity. He's basically just saying this is survey data. It's not his personal view or anything. He's just reporting on survey data, which is probably fairly reliable. He goes on and says, look, people on both sides basically think this is going on. And people on both sides think, yes, there is some other side, or there are other views of things which are really quite different from my own. So that's kind of supposed to be descriptive. This is fairly, widely accepted. Something like this is going on. The bigger question is just what, if anything, is supposed to be done about it. Right? You could think about different views, and this kind of relates to some of the things we are saying. It's possible that if you were taking the sort of view that Rorty was proposing, it's possible that if you found yourself on one of these, say, two or more sides, you might not think it obvious that there's anything that's supposed to be done. You might actually think that maybe this is all fine and perhaps the way it ought to be, that certain, there was a certain unity that perhaps just wasn't supposed to be. That identity was always kind of artificial or something, and it's unraveling, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe. Or you could be, and maybe this would be seemingly more like kind of Harding and Murphy in their own ways, trying to think, no, there is something we ought to do about it and try somehow to put things back together. So this particular author is probably more leaning in that direction. Anyway, it doesn't so much matter. The next quote begins with the word if. So, if we were to think that, if we are to continue to make one out of many, right? He's obviously referring to the slogan, E pluribus unum, which I think you'll find on the dollar bill. If we're going to do that, then basically he thinks, well, people on both sides just have to step back from the reactivity, right? The kind of sort of knee-jerk, instantaneous, highly partisan views and the way things are approached right now, and take up the more arduous task of weaving a new national narrative in which all Americans can see themselves. Very much. It's harder. Of course, it's easier to kick back and do nothing and let it all unravel, but it might be worth the effort to try to take up the much more difficult task. The key thing is here, it's something new, right? That's what really seems to distinguish, say, Harding and Murphy from Rorty. There's really something new to be done. We got to bring some kind of new view, some new understanding that would be more inclusive in order to make things better, as opposed to just kind of letting things go as they currently are. So anyway, that's kind of fairly descriptive. You can just think about that. Some other ideas here are about the same thing, but it's interesting because it's put in terms of an epistemic crisis, so that connects very closely with everything we've been talking about. So this author just puts it in those terms, right? That the division or the conflict really has a kind of epistemic character, right? It actually really has to do with questions about knowledge, questions about justification, right? Ultimately about what we take to be true and real. That's really where, kind of the issue is, or that's where the real action is. That's the real split. So in some ways it works well with Rorty, because Rorty, perhaps some of the conclusions you might agree with or maybe not, but sort of that deeper point that what really holds a community together has to do with a shared sense of justification and how things are considered to be true. You could say, well, that is the problem here, that there is a breakdown at that deeper level currently, and people are thinking different things on different bases. So that's why it's interesting. It's not necessarily the case, say, that some people still value, say, facts and others don't. Sometimes it's seen that way from either of the two sides. It's often thought the other side doesn't care about facts. It's probably more accurate to say everybody cares about facts, but they have a different way of determining what they are, and that's the problem. So anyway, that's kind of what this person is describing here, I think. A kind of tribal epistemology. I don't know if that's a good name or not, but just to say there's different sides, basically, which really then each reflect the way that Rorty was characterizing a pragmatic sense of truth, basically, and having no inclination or just, sort of losing sight or of something higher, some kind of, say, trans-partisan standards and so on. That's kind of what's being lost. Anyway, this goes on a little bit more. I think it's the same thing, basically. Let me just check here. The result, as a nation, we no longer share the same facts. We no longer live in the same world. In a way, that's kind of just rhetorical, but in a way, it's not. In a certain way, it's very concrete way of describing what's going on. And if you think about it, you might agree that it captures a lot, and it offers a good way of understanding how it could possibly be that some of the disagreements and so on that do go on could possibly happen. And then this author says, it's hard to imagine how we may bridge this gulf, basically. Well, maybe it is, maybe it's not. Now, as we said, though, it's not a given that we're even supposed to bridge the gulf. Perhaps, e pluribus unum was wrong. Perhaps one was not supposed to be made out of many. Maybe the many should be different. Who knows? That's a possible view to take. You can just sort of think that this unraveling is a good thing. That's a possible view. Many people will probably disagree and think, no, we want to try to address this, try to put things back together, try to fix things and so on. This person is saying it's hard to imagine how we could do that, and that may be so, but certainly, I think, the ideas that we see in Harding about strong objectivity are intended to address kind of exactly this sort of thing, basically to try to step back and think, how is it that we might come up with a perspective on things that can take different sides into account and try to work out something that could reflect it better and that might be more acceptable to everybody? It's certainly not obvious. It certainly would be an arduous task to do it. The real question basically is whether or not there is sufficient motivation to do so, and that's what brings us back to the question of I and we, whether, one feels, to put it this way, a kind of solidarity with all, in this case, all Americans, all people here, basically, across these lines, and thinking that, yes, it might then therefore be worthwhile to try to take up this arduous task to figure out a way to understand ourselves in a new way which would not lead to these problems, basically. Right? Or conversely, to accept a much narrower, more limited sense of we and just kind of stick to that and have the larger thing fall apart or unravel as was described. So that seems to be a pretty important, pretty pressing, pretty pertinent kind of issue. It's certainly one way you can try to think in more concrete terms about these things we're thinking about here with Rorty and with Harding and Murphy.